Hello, my name's Cindy Barber and I'm author of the Chronicle of Killian series. The first book is called Keeper of the Keystone. In the first two chapters, Mathis has been attacked in an alleyway and his great uncle has found the ring that he was desperate to hide from the assailant. We're continuing with chapter 3 called Missing. Swallowing a mouthful of stone-cold tea, Catherine scrunched her face with distaste. She had made a fresh pot ready for Mathis's return from work, but his cup remained on the breakfast bar with 2 spoonfuls of sugar still unstirred in the bottom. Tense with frustration, she considered her options. Should she keep his tea hot or give up hope and throw it away? Picking up her book, she tried to read to stop herself from worrying, but was interrupted by the chime of the clock. 11 o'clock. He had been missing 2 hours. Awakened by the sound of chimes, Michael stirred in the second bedroom, but Catherine was too worried to notice. Rising to her feet, she headed to the window of their small 2-bedroom flat and peered down at the dusty street below in anticipation of her husband's arrival. The street was deserted, and for the first time since they'd met, she was worried about him. Anxious, she phoned his workplace, hoping that they had asked him to stay on late. When a polite voice informed her that he had left at his usual time, the answer hit her like a blow to the stomach. Shaking uncontrollably, she hung up. Her heart pounded wildly. She knew something was wrong. He'd never been late without telling her before. Hearing Michael for the first time, she stared into his room, sadly aware that in less than an hour her baby boy would be a year old. His presence sat by the coffee table, lovingly wrapped by her and Mathis before he had set off for work. She had clicked with Mathis from the moment they'd met. Of course they rowed sometimes, usually about money, but they were happy. He wouldn't just leave them. Something was wrong, and she was forced to consider the possibility that he might not be there tomorrow, or the day after. She didn't know how she would cope looking after Michael on her own. She'd never considered being a single mother. Her mind filled with morbid thoughts. What if he'd been robbed, mugged, murdered even? Her overactive imagination explored every possibility until her head ached and her eyes began to feel heavy. Returning to the comforting arms of her sofa, tiredness swept over her like a blanket, as her thoughts once more drifted over the day's events and into the future. What would happen to them now? Catherine woke to the sound of Michael crying, wanting his morning feed. Exhausted, she dragged herself from the settee, straightened the creases of her skirt and staggered into his room, gazing lovingly at the blonde-haired baby in the cot. Allowing his hand to grab hold of her finger, she halted abruptly as she remembered. Mathis, her husband, he hadn't come home. Adrenaline surged through her as she rushed to their bedroom. Flinging wide the door, she looked at their bed, but it remained empty. Racing to the bathroom, she peered round the door and then hurried into their tiny kitchen, hoping to find him preparing breakfast. Disappointment clawed at her as the rooms remained empty. He hadn't come home. Returning sadly to her son, she scooped him up and hugged him tightly to her chest. As she carried Michael through to the front room, the phone rang. Quickly, she picked up the receiver, hoping to hear Mathis's voice at the other end. "Catherine?" It was just Jane. Her heart fell. "Yes," was all she could manage, her throat dry. "I need to talk to someone." Well, Catherine wasn't really ready to play agony aunt to someone, but Jane didn't wait for an answer. "Oh, Catherine, it was awful. I still can't believe what's happened." She paused to gather her thoughts. "Last night, as John and I took Alfie round the farmer's field for our usual evening walk, we heard arguing coming from the farmhouse. At first we thought it was a normal argument, so we didn't want to interfere, especially as we don't really know the family. I mean, they've only been there a couple of months. We barely even say hello to them." "And?" Catherine encouraged, eager for her best friend to get to the point. She really wanted to focus on finding a husband, but she didn't have the heart to refuse her closest friend, especially she sounded so distraught. "I wish I'd have done something instead of ignoring it. It was horrific. The next thing we heard was gunshots, 3 of them, and they sounded so loud. We were literally only metres from the house. The noise was deafening. John lost his grip on Alfie's lead and the poor dog scarpered across the field. It took John ages to catch him. I was so scared the poor thing would get lost. Well, I couldn't help John catch him, what with my bad knee. And I was too scared to go inside, so I called the police. Catherine could hear her breaking down on the other end of the phone, and no wonder, she thought. What a horrific thing to happen. After a few deep breaths, Jane continued, her voice unsteady, as she checked back the tears. When John came back with Alfie, we hid behind a gate as we waited for the police. Neither of us wanted to saw anyone leave, so we presumed that whoever had fired the gunshot must still be in there. I can't remember ever being so scared. Oh, Jane, how awful, Catherine mumbled, trying to get her head around what she was being told. And at the farmhouse, poor people. They haven't been there long. She'd only chatted to the woman once, little more than a week ago, and she even seemed quite kind as far as she could remember. She couldn't believe it had happened so near to her flat. Fortunately, the police were there within minutes, cordoning off the area. We waited nearby in case we were needed as witnesses, and so saw them bring out the bodies covered in white sheets, just like in the movies. Catherine, the poor woman and her 2 children, they were dead, killed outright. It was so horrific. I couldn't stop crying. What if we'd knocked on the door? Maybe we could have stopped the row, prevented it from happening. They might still be alive. Captivated by this tragedy, Catherine couldn't help but think how strange it was that this had happened the same evening that Mathis had disappeared. What about her husband? Did he do it? Catherine asked. Well, that's the weird thing. I could have sworn I heard him, well, a man at least. But when they searched the house, he wasn't there. No men were found, dead or alive. Yet both John and I were absolutely certain that we'd heard a man's voice. Catherine heard Jane sigh down the phone and wished she could give her friend the support she needed. So, do you have any idea who's responsible? Was it too much of a coincidence that her husband had gone missing the same night these murders had occurred locally? Perhaps Mathis had seen or heard something suspicious. What if... Oh, I don't think anyone's been arrested yet. John and I were being questioned at the police station all last night. They kept asking if we'd heard what the row was about and if we were certain we'd heard a man's voice. I don't think they can explain it at the moment. We've not long been home. Poor Alfie, he was on his own all night, and after such a shock. He was so pleased to see me this morning, bless him. So they didn't find anyone else. Well, then who shot them? What if Mathis had been involved? Jane? Yes? What time did it happen? Catherine asked tentatively. Well, we went for a walk around 10, so not long after then. Sliding from her hands, the receiver landed on the floor, staring into nothingness. Tears rolled down her pale cheeks. Unable to explain why, she instinctively knew that somehow her husband's disappearance was connected to the awful events at the farmhouse. Taking hold of the receiver once more, she apologised to Jane, promised to meet up soon, and then called the emergency services. That evening, she sat in front of a blank screen on the television. Michael, her one reminder of Mathis, shoved his toys in his mouth, enjoying the sensation of eating them more than playing with them. Torn wrapping paper littered the floor, while the cake she had laboured over lovingly remained untouched on the plate. She had reported Mathis missing. Nothing much they could do, they'd told her, just as she had anticipated. Instinctively, she had known ever since her conversation with Jane that he wasn't coming home. She didn't know what had happened, or why, or whether she'd ever know the truth. But she did know that from now on, she was on her own. The thought of being a single mother scared her, and not for the first time that evening, she sobbed uncontrollably for everything she had lost and for everything she would never have. Thank you for listening.